Hello there, I'm Scontulus, and this is a tier list for every single card currently playable in TEPPEN Standard Ranked. At the moment, there are 104 cards currently playable in the game at the nearly 1 year moment since AVP has released. And to send off my favorite set in the game, we are going to rank every card that you can currently play in Ranked. There will be timestamps to skip to each set, and before we get into it, just so we're on the same page, every card in the game, really, they're legendary cards. They're pretty good. They're designed to be good, except for maybe the F tier cards are pretty playable. S tier cards, just to be clear, are the cards that are the very best in the game. These are the cards in the best decks that are beating the best decks, that are played by the best players, that have no answers, really. A+ tier cards are about on the same level, but they might be a bit more exclusive or require some setup, but they are pretty much just better than any other card. If you're able to play them, just having these cards and summoning them will put you in a better position than your opponent, just because that is the power level of these cards. When we get down to B+, they might be a little more archetypal or more exclusive, but cards at this level will generally be a lot of value anytime you can summon them. B tier cards are where we might start to see some more exclusions to a card, where it might be specific to an archetype, and C tier cards, it's really a choice if you want to play them or not, but any cards above that, if you're playing a color, it's a pretty safe choice if you would just want to craft this card and play a deck around it, play it in a deck. C tier cards you might have to work a little harder for. Cards in this tier might not have as strong of a payoff. D tier cards might have a much harder payoff or might not be worth the payoff, and F tier cards are clearly outclassed or just not worth playing at all. So, getting right into it, we are going to start with the cards that will never leave the game, and we are going to start with the color that I'm the least familiar with. It's the one color I don't play. Red players will have to let me know how I do. We're going to start off with Rathalos. He has some good synergy with Momo and Nina, able to proc both of their quests, and he is playable in the new Big Red Blazing Wall deck, but there are more newer legendaries that don't cost 8 MP, so I think overall he is a good choice, but not quite the best choice you can make in a red deck. He is definitely a good card in Big Red specifically. He can end some games, and people aren't quite expecting him as much as some other cards, like the most iconic legendary of all in TEPPEN, Fate-Defying Ryu. This card has a major reputation as being the most overpowered card the game has ever seen. This card can potentially be throwing around 20 damage Hadokens, removing any unit in the game, and attacking effects happen before his attack happens, so anytime he removes something, he gets in 3 damage, and agility makes him extremely dangerous for ending the game. But in reality, with Denjin nerfed, there's only one deck you're really seeing this card in, and that is Blazing Wall. He's still an amazing finisher, but he's only playable as a finisher. You can't play this card turn 1, which is actually an advantage that Dread King Rathalos does have over Ryu. I think I'm still going to leave Rathalos in C, but FDR isn't quite the shining star that he used to be. You do also see him in mono red damage decks, but those aren't a whole lot better than Blazing Wall. I will give him A+ tier for now, but we'll see if he keeps it throughout the entire tier list. Confidently, I will say that Dual Dragon Hado is absolutely as good or better than FDR, because I'm going to move FDR back down to A. It does what red wants to do better than any other 2 damage card, and you all, if you've been playing, you know how good Jolt is. This card is just better than Jolt. Next, we have Dragon's Lord's Punishment, which I think is a very interesting card because overall, there have been a lot of more recent cards that have been inspired by Dragon's Lord's Punishment, but not all of them quite live up to the hype of the original. This card is still pretty good if you're playing a mono red damage type of deck, and those decks are still not too bad. 5 MP for 12 damage might not seem like the best thing in 2020 TEPPEN, with there being a lot of other more efficient cards at lower MP cost, but this still does deal with just about any unit in the game, and split among everybody, you can tear down just about any board. I would almost give this card B+, because it's still quite playable, but there are a lot of newer cards that are better than it, so we will come back to the placement of this card, I'm sure. Moving on to the green cards from core, we have my boy, Advanced Artifact X, who has, after being not the greatest card for a while, gotten surprisingly stronger with cards like Storm Owl and the 1-4 MP machine buffing action. But even with those cards, he's still kind of a niche choice, about on the same level, if not below Dragon Lord's Punishment. I'll honestly put him on the same level as Dread King Rathalos, as much as I want to put him higher. I don't think he's quite the meta threat. Similar to Heavenly Kicks Chun, this card is pretty aggro, but it doesn't really have any good synergy with any current strong decks like these other deck cards potentially do, but it still can win you games out of nowhere, so it's at least C tier. And I suppose it might seem like I'm rating a couple of these core legendaries kind of low. We'll put Roaring Typhoon up here as kind of a benchmark of whether a card is worth keeping the craft or not. These cards are all pretty good if you want to make them good, but they're not really worth going out of your way to craft, while anything above this is definitely worth having. So with that benchmark in mind, we can put Soul Offering up here. If you pull this card, you can make it work in a high MP boost type of deck as a surprise finisher, and it does actually activate Storm Owl, so this card is way better than you might think. I could put it above Roaring Typhoon, but it's not generically good. You really have to go out of your way to make this card good. So next, moving on to the purple cards from core, we have the most nerfed card of all time, in my opinion. Indirectly, Dark Libido Morrigan is a truly F-tier card. I hate to say it, there won't be very many F-tier cards, and I hate to put a fan favorite like Morrigan down in F, but she actually does not work as intended anymore. Normally when you would activate cards, she would lock down a lane and become a win condition in that lane. But now, over time, you are losing MP and the unit is getting closer over time. You're not really getting anywhere by playing this card, and she is unfortunately hardly playable at all. I hope they make her reset attack lines, fix this card in some way, because the card is really cool, and if they limit the playstyle to one card, I think it could be very cool. Next we have Devil Trigger Dante. 4 damage, flight agility, is a very quick clock to end the game at any time in the game, which, speaking of, Devil Trigger can make the same thing out of almost any purple unit, but it requires a bit more effort. I think it's probably a B tier card, right above Dragon Lord's Judgment. We'll see if it moves up at the very end, but realistically it probably is just a B tier card. You really have to be playing a Veil type of deck with Natalia Corda. You know, speaking of, yeah, it's a B+, it's as good, it's at least as good as Dante. That deck is terrifying, who am I kidding? And we finally get to what I think will surprise very few people is our first S tier card in the game. This card beats any other card. It's as simple as that, and it makes it your card. That is an unprecedented swing and advantage. Almost no card can replicate that amount of advantage. The only thing limiting the power level of this card is the fact that you only have 1 copy, so you have to draw it and get lucky, while your opponent might have 3 copies of something scary like Alligator. But this card really does check a lot of things in the meta, and should undoubtedly be at the very top of any list of the best cards in TEPPEN. Next we have the black cards, who don't really come out the best from core. Their best card from core is probably Spreading Infection, which I guess I'll put right above Chun. I suppose it is an easy to use card that only takes up 1 deck slot and potentially gets you a lot of value later in the game, but I can't really think of what deck specifically this card pushes to the top of the game. It's a good card, but it's not really an amazing card. I'll give black players credit though, and put it right above Dread King Rathalos. Blood Destiny, on the other hand, is going to be our first card that is playable, but definitely not quite something that you will typically go out of your way to play. This card takes a lot of investment and has a game-losing side effect, and with black aggro no longer able to take advantage of 2-color like it once was, this card doesn't really have a place at the moment and is pretty hard to make work. Heir to Ambition Wesker is also a very difficult card to make work that I think we have to put in D tier because it is completely unusable until the very end of the game, and once it hits the field, it's just a big beat stick. There are better cards than this that are easier to use, that have synergy with things, and the same is basically true of Legend Eater Nergigante. At the very least, Nergigante will enable your personality import to have the very rare Veil, but other than that, this card does more damage to most decks than good, and for 6 MP, these cards are slightly behind what you want for your big boss monsters. And now, moving on to AVP, we have some extremely cool and iconic cards that are a big part of why I had to do this list. Before rotation happened, Miles Edgeworth can delete any card in the game at the very beginning of the game, which I think will put him, for now, at least slightly above Fate-Defying Ryu. Edgeworth will be dearly missed when he rotates. Next we have Psycho Witness Dan, who, similar to Edgeworth, is a very easy to use card who you can just throw down and typically get a bit of value off of. He can protect your other units. It's hard to say that this card is not A tier. You know, Fate-Defying Ryu in the same tier as Dan doesn't quite seem right. We'll see if he sticks around at the top, but he's definitely not in the same tier as Dan. We'll see if Dan stays in this tier, but this card is very good. Moving on, we have Provocation Legend. This is a great card to punish anytime your opponent activates Action Phase, but it's not really a great card to activate for a 2 MP yourself. Considering most decks want to activate their hero art, it's hard to say that this card is anything worse than A tier. We'll start out with When Something Smells, which is an unprecedented card. This card is very similar to Psycho Witness Dan, being a 3 MP unit that's slightly above curve that protects your entire field, and the big difference being that small green decks are a lot better than small red decks right now. Arguably being the best deck in the game, we will at least put this card at A+, because he's not quite the best card in his deck, which is what will get him into S tier. Larry Butts is surprisingly one of the strongest cards in TEPPEN. Next we have Ace Attorney Phoenix, who, similar to Larry, is one of the cards that currently defines the metagame. The difference between him and Larry being that he is the card that ends the game. Phoenix is a crazy comeback mechanic in a deck that does not need one, being big green, letting you charge 6 MP for free, and potentially letting you play his other signature action. Brilliant Turnabout makes this card something to be feared, and the chance to pull legendaries for lower than their cost is something that cannot be overstated. This is one of the best cards in the game at the moment. Moving on to the purple cards from AVP. These ones, despite purple being very strong at the moment, aren't quite as meta-defining. Fearsome Witness Trish is quite a large investment for 8 MP, and is clearly meant to be played with Cyclock. Her typing being Demon does give her synergy with the current, yeah, she's going in D. I'm not gonna lie, even with her Demon typing, maybe I could convince myself that she belongs in C tier, since she is very similar to Devil Hunter Dante in stats and how she performs, but for 8 MP, I'm going to, at least at the moment, put her in D tier. Next we have Helpful Medium Maya, who has one of the most unique effects in the game, repeatedly summoning cards from the graveyard that you have set up before her, the most high MP cards from the graveyard, which gives her synergy with one of the best decks in the game, Breakaway. You would think this card is an easy A tier, but realistically, this card is a bit awkward compared to cards that are easy finishers like Dante. I think she is honestly a B tier card. I want to put her in Dante's tier because I really like this card, but realistically, it's not quite tearing up the game. and it's easier to play Dante than it is to play Maya. The last purple card from AVP, Cyclock, is much easier to use than Maya actually, and despite being a very low impact card, is a card that is very commonly played in the best purple deck. You technically can play it for free, it pays for itself the second that you cast it, it builds memory, but it's not the most interesting card. I want to put it in B+, but it is very heavily played, so I think it belongs in A. Next we have the black cards from AVP, which are some of my favorite cards. Franziska is the centerpiece of the Ouroboros strategy, and is one of the most devastating cards that can be dropped on your opponent. This card will end the game out of nowhere, and has a lot of counterplay, honestly, but the power level of this card is absolutely worth 8 MP, and being able to summon it multiple times in a game puts it on its own level. It's at least an A tier card. There's no way I can put this card below A. The same cannot be said of Gearhead Witness Abigail. I had to look that one up. His deck is not quite around the way it was on release, and requires more investment, honestly, than Trish to make into a powerful card. I wish I could put this card higher. It's only 6 MP, but to make it anything more than a 110, you have to build around it, and the strategy that you would build around it is not remotely something that you would be playing right now, especially with it about to rotate. I wish I could put this card higher. The last card from AVP, Sharing Memories, really defines black. Honestly, this card does not compare to the other black cards in AVP, or really any of the other cards so far, because just like Brainwashed, this card will beat any other card. If you activate this card after your opponent uses their evidence for Brilliant Turnabout, you can use Sharing Memories to completely wipe their field, and then you can use Despair. Sharing Memories is one of the cards that makes Oichi Despair a top tier strategy, and this is undoubtedly one of the strongest cards currently in the game. Black players will miss this card. Next we have Dragons of War, which is one of the last sets in a while that red players have come out on top. Nina, we are gonna move right up to, at the very least, A+. Nina basically allows any red deck to do what it's trying to do easier. If you're a quest deck or a growth deck, Nina will help you accomplish your win con. If you're a control deck, she will get you control cards. If you just need a dangerous card on the field, Nina is that. She is one of the best cards for red, but she's not quite better than the big green cards at the moment. Next we have Rathalos Kin Mary, who is a very flashy card in a couple of different decks like Antibody, and is a killer finisher that can be a very hard to deal with win con if you get 2 shields on her, but is a bit of a high investment compared to one other card in the same set. I think that you can do a lot with this card if you are a skilled red player, but this one comes down to personal preference and skill if you want to play Rathalos Kin Mary. Next we have Fated Riders, which is the first of our Dragon Lords-like cards, and this card is a lot more efficient than Dragon Lords. At 3 MP for 10 damage, that's only 2 less damage than Dragon Lords, and you also get Art Charge 4, I think is what it was. This card is pretty crazy if you get the full setup for it, but its deck isn't exactly tearing up the game right now. I suppose if you have a lot of Momo and Nina in your deck, you could play this card generically, but you're realistically playing this card in a growth deck, and that deck is strong enough that I do potentially want to move this up to B+, but for now we're just gonna put it right above Mia, I think. Next we have the green cards from DOW, starting with Elite Rider Shakuna. She seems really strong. I have the card, I've tried to play the card, but it's not the most terrifying card. I think the newer Shakuna is actually the scarier card than this card. This card seems pretty good. I feel like, out of respect for green players, who will beat me every time, I should put it in B+, but I think it's about on the level of Fated Riders, where it's good in its deck. Noble Thief Ray, on the other hand, is one of the cards that has generically made Big Green, one of the scariest decks in the game. This card is at least as good as cards like Franziska that enable their specific deck. You can just play this card down generically and run away with the game. Next we have Hero's Charge, which is a much scarier win condition than Shakuna, but since we already established her power level, I think I'm just gonna put it right above her. And now, moving on to the purple cards from DOW, we have the newly buffed Hope of the Brood Ryu, who actually now costs 6 MP, and I don't think this card has quite cracked into the game. You can play it if you like to. If you think the card is cool, you can make it work. It can run away with games, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite something that has changed things. So I think it's about on the level of Mia. Next we do have Fatalis, who is a very strong card. This card is a lot of value over time in the game. I think this card is really cool. It might realistically be a B tier, but we'll just put it at the tail end of B+ for now. Next we have the Divine Army's Fall, which actually counters a lot of opening plays, but you have to get kind of lucky with it. It's kind of like a much worse Brainwashed, where you don't get any value out of it, and you have to be pretty lucky with it. Usually you'll pair this card with the hero art Quicksilver so that you can get cards in the range of it. Quicksilver is a little better than Growth Red, so we'll put it, it's not quite as good as Questfire. This is where it belongs. And next we have the black cards for DOW. Miria is a very strong counter to a lot of opens, but she has a huge downside. The best use of this card I've seen is in Bringer of Nightmare, where you can potentially kill your own units, I suppose, and set up Bringer, and then you can play a card that is guaranteed to be below 5 MP afterwards. I have definitely seen this card be very strong, but the downside is so massive that you have to really be going out of your way to play around it. Next we have Traitor Tyrant Raymarsh, which similarly has a huge cost of 5 life when you play this card, but the potential tempo swing with Traitor Tyrant Raymarsh puts this card easily as one of the higher tier cards in the game. It is heavily played in change form and can remove any threat from the game. Next we have the Goddess Dagger, which similarly is a card that you will see in almost any black deck, which is really what defines cards in A+ tier. This is the first card in A+ that I think I will say is stronger than When Something Smells. Goddess Dagger almost makes it into S tier, considering you will play this card in almost any black deck, but the fact that you're only playing it as a comeback card kinda keeps it in A+ for me. And now we are moving on to Island of Fear, one of the most infamous sets, probably the most hated set in the game at the moment. Starting off with red, we have Resolute Survivor Claire. That might be the wrong name. I will probably be corrected below if somebody cares to, but this card is very powerful in its specific deck, which is either Ultimate Weapon or Antibody, and that is not one of the strongest decks in the game, but this is a very strong card in those decks. You can also play it in generic red damage decks if you really go out of your way, but it's better in decks that have in-archetype explorers like Ultimate Weapon. Next we have Hidden Danger BB Hood, which I think is actually archetypally easier to play. It's not as limited in the decks you can play it in, but it's not quite as high impact. I actually do think I might put it up higher than Claire, because it's very similar to Fate Defying Ryu, but it's not really going to end you the game. You can play this card on turn 1. You know, the more I talk about it, the more I think it deserves to be slightly above Dan. I think this is a very good card. It's easy to underrate, which is what I was about to do. The last red card from IOF, it's No Time to Waste. You can potentially get your shotgun explored for free if you use blue MP, and the ability to play this card in really any red deck that you want to, potentially explore for a surprise rocket launcher at the end of the game to turn things around, puts this card at least at the same level as Dual Dragon Hado. And now we have the green cards for IOF. We have Lone Wolf Survivor John. I had to look that one up. because he has kind of fallen out of the game a little bit. His deck was very scary in its respective release season, but he is a little more difficult to play. He is still surprisingly generically a decent card if you just play him in a tribal deck because he is a beast. But this card isn't running away with games the way it once was. Next we have Nurse Survivor Cinnamon, a card that any dedicated X player will jam in every deck. But realistically, all this card does is get killed. It takes a lot of setup to actually be very powerful, unlike other cards that you can just play down and get value off of. My personal bias prevents me from putting it any lower than this, but it's not the strongest card outside of Charge Shot. Green's last card from IOF is Stay Close, which gives any unit protection from any action. It's kind of an awkward card to read, but anytime your opponent targets one of your units, you can respond with this to turn their action into a buff action. They have lost immense value and you are about to win the game. This card counters any other action, including Brainwashed, and is one of the cards that makes small green tribal heart tank currently arguably the best deck in the game. Next we have Guiding Survivor Rose, and just like before, I think the fact I had to look this one up kind of speaks for the realistic power level of this one. I hate that to be an indicator, but lock decks are surprisingly decent. I don't think this card is even an auto include in those decks, which is why I will put it at the top of C tier, even though it has gotten much stronger since release with the release of the DTL lock cards. Next we have Killing Machine the Owl. I don't know its correct name. Leshku is one of the strongest cards in the game. It's at least A+. I think the only thing that makes me not want to put it in S tier is that you have to take a lot of time to set up this card, but it does completely run away with the game. And in Breakaway, where you can recycle the owls and play an owl into an owl, buffing up the first owl, having 3 owls is one of the stupidest things in the game right now, and it'll be around for a while. Time Distorted is a card very similar to the previously ranked Cyclock. This card, instead of letting yourself go even on MP, hits your opponent for the MP, so you're still technically going even on it, and if you use it with Memory 7, you go plus on MP in a weird aggressive way. This is a really cool card, and it's very transparent in what it does. It's just there to build MP. You're not really trying to actually use the Memory 7 effect, you just want to use it like you use Cyclock. File Surveyor Alex Wesker is a super good card. This card is literally a 7 MP unit that only costs 4 MP, and you get to block as a 4 MP unit before it becomes this powerful 7 MP unit. The Vile Killer form is so powerful. The Ascend can potentially be a good bonus in Raging Demon, which is one of the decks right now that are keeping all of the other decks in check, like Small Green. This card is so easy to play and get value off of in any black deck that it is easily an A+ tier card. Next we have Lisa Trevor. I'm kind of done looking up all of the names. I don't remember. I even play this card and I don't remember its name. I think this card is very good and I am going to put it in B+, mostly because I like it. And the last black card on IOF's release, Rite of Reincarnation. This card can summon any unit in your graveyard, and if you use it in response to a play that will destroy one of your units, it's free value. It's literally free. You will pay blue MP, you won't pay any MP, and you will get a unit to the field. I think this card is about on the level of the other powerful 2 MP cards we have in A+ here. And we will move on to the first set of supplemental cards. First we have Take the Shot. I don't remember the actual name of this card, but I think this one is actually pretty good. You have to play it specifically in growth decks, but I've honestly kind of gotten beat by players that use this card sometimes. It's at least C tier. We'll put it in C tier. Maybe it deserves to be higher, but it's it's the best C tier card. Next we have Barry, who is definitely a card that does not even feel like a supplemental card. This card has definitely cut out a place for himself. but he's kind of fallen by the wayside because of his nerfs. I think he's about as good as Fatalis, and a little easier to use maybe, so he'll sit in B+ for now. Next we have Letter for Lottie, which is a powerful comeback kind of card. I don't know, this card is very strong. It's basically free MP. It discounts something by 1 MP. It's kind of similar to these cards that are up in A, but I think it's a little overrated. I'll put it at the top of B+. Next we have Ustanak, who is a super cool card. He can just keep coming back forever, but he's not gonna go in every deck. I think he's very, very powerful. He's definitely a B+ tier card, I think. And now we are moving on to the first of the Trilogy of the Goddess with Mission of Ruin. Starting off, we have Rebel Guardian Epsilon, who is 6 MP and takes quite a while to set up. He's very similar to the last card we ranked, but is much higher impact in his deck, and I think the deck that he's in is pretty underrated. Faith CEM, I think, is what you'll play this card in, and if you really get this card set up into a big unit with Crush powering up everything else, he can be a nightmare to deal with, and will probably end the game. Next we have Recharged Soul Zinogre, which I used to think was a pretty overrated card, but this card has really came into its own with Blazing Wall. This card has a huge downside, honestly. If you deal with this card before it gets going, it does not get going. Blazing Wall is a great way to mitigate that effect, and there are a lot of cards that can make this card even stronger, but the reason this card isn't in A tier, despite being in a meta deck, is that it can't take advantage of all of the cards, like breaking the Sanctuary that you play in Blazing Wall. Next we have Aid to Rebellion, which is the next one of our Dragon Lords-like cards, and I think I'm gonna go out and say is slightly harder to use than Dragon Lords. Even though Faith is a very powerful pushed mechanic, I don't really see this card. I'll put it above Dragon Lords out of the hypothetical that this is more value, but I think Dragon Lords being easier to use shouldn't be overrated. Next, the green cards from MOR, and despite the come up that green had in the trilogy, these ones are a little bit mixed. First we have Sorrowful Guardian Juno, which potentially its design seems like it's supposed to be similar to the other 3 drops like Larry, where it's slightly above curve, and potentially I guess it gets, I'm putting it in C, spoilers. But this card is kind of like a choice if you want to play it. I don't know, maybe you can make it good in a mono green Faith deck, but the best Faith deck with cards like this is a machine deck, and this card definitely doesn't get in that deck. On the other hand, Aid to Repose is insane in the 2-color machine Faith deck, which is still a pretty strong deck. I'll put this card at least on the level of Zinogre. I'm gonna leave it in B+, because there's only one deck you're playing it in, really, which is Red-Green Faith, but that deck is pretty crazy, and this card is one of the big cards that lets it get going. Next we have the Avatar Nerf Gamut, which, oh my god, I don't even know what's going on with this card. He's 6 MP, he's 3/5, and he's got like 5 keywords, but like they don't go together at all. So he's got Faith, and he's got like Flight and Shield, so he's supposed to become like the Wincon or something, but he's giving +2/+2 to another card in your hand, not to himself, so he's not the Wincon, but he's absorbing all these Faith buffs, but he has Faith, so maybe you want him to die, but he has Shield and Flight, so he's not going to die, and he has this crazy downside where like he's all strong and flying in the air, and your opponent's trying to take him down, and every time they hit him, he buffs up your whole field, and since it takes a while to take him down, you can just play units as you're taking him down, and their field gets crazy, and then he's dead, and you come away with 1 unit in your hand, like maybe you invested into something crazy, but they have a whole field of super buffed up dudes that they would never be able to have. This card's a disaster. It says a lot. I knew from the start I was putting this in F. It says a lot that this card is completely outclassed by what I think is like a common or a rare Wally, which gives +2/+2 to anything in your hand, to any green card. It's way better. This card only gives it to Faith cards. I don't know what you're giving it to. The best thing that you could have given Faith to would have been one of these guys, because he's like a flying, dangerous guy. This card sucks. Next, we have the purple cards from MOR, and these cards are so cool. I mean, just look at them. Virgil is such a good card, honestly. We already have his brother Dante in B+ tier. This card is at least as good as Dante. I'm gonna give him his best case scenario and say that you just bounce something back to the hand. And if you did that, then this card is extremely powerful. Now that I'm actually looking at what else is in A tier, I think he's better than Rathalos Kinmary. Moving on to the next purple card, Saddler is a really devastating card when you get hit by a Saddler. Maybe it's just me, but I always forget that this card is coming because your opponent plays down a Faith card. You play down anything, you get punished super hard. I want to put this in A tier, but it's not quite generically good. Aid to Dominion, very similarly, is just about kind of the same card. It can steal anything, the big difference being that you can play this one generically. This card is almost exactly like Brainwashed, which we've established is an S tier card. You want to start playing purple, you can put these two cards in any deck and you have a good control engine. Next we have DeCapre, who now looks completely different than this image, is a 6 MP 2/9, I think, something like that. D for DeCapre. You all know it's true. Just kidding, this card is actually still very strong. I think that you can play this card generically in Despair. The only deck you're not going to play it in is Ouroboros, because it removes itself from the graveyard. It's just not worth the investment in Uro. I've tried it. It sucks in Uro. But in other decks, even decks that want to play Zavi for the combo, you can still play it. I think this card belongs in B+. It's at least as good as Fatalis. Maybe it's not better than Barry, but it's still a good card. Zavi, I think, is definitely the card that's nerfed a little more. I think that the deck that Zavi actually shines in and has gotten a little more attention lately is Ashura Senku, and that is absolutely a very good deck. But I'm just gonna put him in B tier. He's not like incredible, but being able to pull an arrow from the deck, if you get an arrow, is really strong. Next we have Aid to Faith, or whatever it was. I don't want to look this one up. This card is pretty good, but it's a very late game card, and it's kind of not necessary. I've never really gotten hit with this card in such a way that I was like, whoa, Aid to the Missionary is like the best card ever. It's gotta be in B tier. Most change form decks will be winning without any actions at all, and I don't think this card quite really pushes itself above being at the top of C tier. We already talked about Epsilon, which is realistically the only place you're gonna see Marino is in the same deck as Epsilon. The sad truth is that this card doesn't quite make the cut in the meta 2-color Faith red-green deck, but it's still a decent card if you really build for it. Next we have a Scent of Heaven's Wheel, or something like that, which is it summons the Shigaru Magala, which heals you for 6. This card's really weird. I don't really think this card's that great. I'll put it above Soul Offering, but I don't think it's quite generically good. I don't think it even makes the cut in its own deck typically. Next we have the Very Angry Tigrex, who is similar to Nerf Gamut, just about an unplayable card. But, like, it hasn't been seen ever. All I've seen of this card is one person on the Discord who regrets buying it and always tries to jam it in decks, and whenever they post a deck list, people ask, why the Tigrex? And they're like, I bought it. I gotta put it in. This supplemental card is not something that I would wish on any purple player, and for that reason, as a cautionary tale, we are going to place it at the bottom of the tier list. Thankfully, the last supplemental card, Personality Import, is nothing like that. This card is perfectly playable, but it kind of takes a lot of setup. It used to be really strong in Ouroboros, when DeCapre would end up in your graveyard and give you some really strong keywords, but without her doing that, I'm not sure what it's really doing right now. And next, we have part 2 of the Goddess Trilogy, Breath of Resistance. Starting off with Colonel, who was one of the most devastating cards in the game. To pull turn 1 off of Nibblesnarf, follow that up with Chun-Li or Rashid, this card could run away with the game, getting a ton of ping damage in, but his deck isn't quite as well represented as it once was. Even with a couple of the cards still being really strong and Hinagiku making a solid replacement for Chun, I don't think this card is quite in its glory days like it was last season. Lost Kingdoms Leo, something like that, is a card that has actually finally came into its own. It was okay to play with a combo with Nina if you just drop these 2 Veil units. What do you do about that? That was always kind of scary. But now with Blazing Wall as a very strong deck of just generic good cards with these other strong cards, you can play Breaking the Sanctuary with this card, keep healing it up. This card is pretty strong. I think it actually does deserve to be at the bottom of A tier. Next we have Marital Feud, which is our next Dragon Lords-like card. This card for 2 MP can do up to 12 damage, which is as much as the original Dragon's Lords. And for being 2 MP that much more efficient, I'm going to put it right next to Colonel because you play it in the same deck. And moving on to the infamous green cards from Breath of the Resistance. Starting off, we have Resistance Leader Karen. She can counter just about anything your opponent will set up and give you the advantage if you set her up properly. I definitely think she belongs about at the same place as FDR. Next, we have the infamous Veteran Huntsman. For 10 MP, there's no way this card could possibly be playable. You have to wait so long to play this card. All he does is give you 3 5 attack units, which are all cast for 10 MP, meaning you can use Rejuvenate to heal them by 6, you can use Evasive to return them to their original stats, you can use Protector's Promise. This card is unparalleled. This is probably the best card to play at turn 1. I think this card deserves to be at the top of the tier list. This card is just a beast in the worst way. Next we have the Kenzuki Resistance, which is a super cool win condition, I think. This card has a ton of flavor, with each level of the effect corresponding to a different character, and if you get all 4, this card is just about the strongest win condition that you can set up. This card is better Trinity, but it's very limited to being in one deck. It's in the Tribe deck, which is right now possibly the best deck in the game. I think it should probably be at the top of A+. Next we have the purple cards from BOR, which, looking at them now, these are not the ones that came off the best from BOR. Sorcerologist Tessa is a super cool card. You can do some really cool shenanigans with this card. It's actually at least a B tier card. You can do the double Dante play, so we're gonna put her right next to Dante's. And you can use her to copy Lilith. You can do a couple of other cool plays. This is a very strong card, but the deck it's in is a very slow deck. Diaz, the other card for coordination, is not quite as easy to play as Tessa, which is already a very gimmicky card. You would think it would be. It's just supposed to be a removal spell, but I almost never see this card, considering how long it takes to set up in a deck that really wants to commit to board anyway, and if you break the board, that deck's gonna lose. You're not gonna play, I'm not sure if this card is quite playable even in its own deck, which is already kinda struggling. So unlike Tessa, this one is definitely gonna be kinda lower in C tier. Next we have Proposing Deicide, the last piece of the coordination deck, and I guess you can probably see I moved Tessa down a little bit. I'll just put this slightly below those cards. I think this card is very cool in that deck. It doesn't require you to suddenly lose the board like DS does, and it's the most powerful type of removal in the game, other than stealing the card. Brainwashed is kind of the best card they've ever made. I'll put Tessa and Proposing right above where Miria are. I think that's the best place for them. Next we have the black cards from BOR. What a mixed bag. We'll start by rating the Goddess Birdcage, which is If this is supposed to be our replacement for sharing memories, I am very disappointed. I really hope we get something better than this next season, because this card is not quite seeing play. Basil Goose, I think I don't know how to say his name, I think he's very underrated. This card can totally get you a lot of value by continually blowing stuff up, but I mean, he kind of costs a little. Vile Schemer Wesker, who is similar to a lot of our top cards, able to counter anything. He's a bit of an investment at 7 MP, but he is a real saving grace for black control decks like Despair that want to stall things out to the end of the game. And when you get this card the second time, it really puts screws on him. This is a very powerful card, and I think it's really keeping a lot of other powerful decks in check. Next we have the Admiral, who in a vacuum has been a crazy card since its release, and has finally kind of came into his own these last couple seasons with the Blazing Wall buff, breaking the Sanctuary. This is a very strong card. If you're a red player, you're probably jamming this guy in everything, because he can just run away with advantage and really steal games. This is a very scary card, and he's super powerful. The next supplemental for BOR is Sanctuary's Gate, which before I got this card, I totally underrated it. It doesn't seem like it does a lot, but 1 MP for 9 HP is super strong. That's like almost as much as Kanzuki. It is generically a very good card. Next we have It Takes Two to Tango, and this one I don't even have information on. This card does not exist. Feel free to prove me wrong. Maybe it's strong and only really undercover secret players are playing it, but I don't know what that means, so I'm gonna leave it in F tier. And the last supplemental for BOR is Yami, one of the coolest legendaries to me, because the second it came out, it just defined a deck and made its own type of thing possible. This card is, I'm going to put it in A tier on that fact alone. Just the fact that this card is irreplaceable. It is one of a kind and is a very, very cool card in my opinion. And finally, moving on to the last released set in TEPPEN at the moment of this video's release, Defying the Light, we have Hado Challenger Ryu, and this card is not the replacement for Leon that it might seem to be on paper. I'm sure some really strong red player can make this card work, but I've only ever seen this card seem like it costs way more than it should for a 2/7, not really have that much of an impact, and get removed before it gets too much art charge. Never really gets the unleash, and if it does, it loses you the game. Next we have Golden Queen Atal Ka, which is a super cool card. This one is a little confusing when you first look at it, and I don't play red, so I don't speak with the most authority. But I've seen this card be extremely powerful, just generically played down with no explorers even, just taking a block and then slowly crawling across the battlefield before dropping these big 5 damage bombs on the enemy's field. I think this is a really strong card. It's a little weird, but I think you don't need to use the when played effect, just block with it, and this card can get you a lot of value. You can make it into a big tank by actually using the cards, but just having it as artillery is really strong. And last from Defying the Light, we have a card that red players' dreams are made of, Heights of Heroism. This card is the last of our Dragon Lords-like cards, and is the first one that is significantly better. This card really pushes a mono red damage type of deck back into something that's playable. GDI and other ultimate weapon-y type of decks can really get a lot out of this card. Your end game will be completely destroyed if you're up against somebody who's playing this. I almost want to put it in A+, but you have to be really dedicated to red to make this one something to be feared. Next, the green cards from DTL, we have Revived Guardian Gar, who is just like such a crazy card. I feel like this guy is super overtuned, with the only consideration being that you have to be about to lose. You have to be at 10 life, which is pretty low, but if this guy unleashes, he's ridiculous. Like, This card is completely unbalanced, I feel like. I don't know what they were thinking with this card. Really silly card, but it's kind of similar to Lechku, like you gotta set it up, but the setup is that you're losing. Not a huge fan of this card. I like that he's dual tribe. He has everything going for him. Next we have Altarion. Sorry, Monster Hunter fans. I think this card didn't quite live up to the hype of being a new staple in Big Green. He has it a little worse than Gar, in my opinion, because Gar is only 5 MP, and this guy is just really a little bit behind if you don't get him the Unleash. The attacking effect can be really strong in matchups where it matters, and the fact that he has a deck that kind of fits around him automatically with Big Green does get him a place in B+, but I don't think he's too much higher than that. Next we have Return from Sanctuary. If this were a card art tier list, this would go right to the top. I think more than any of the other Unleashed cards, this card struggles from the fact that you need to be losing, and more than that, you have to build your entire deck around it kind of to get a lot of value out of it. Phoenix is about to rotate too, which is probably the main reason you would play this card, to pull Phoenix from deck, and most of your good targets for it will probably be out of the deck by the time you use it. Next we have Sin Devil Trigger Dante, who can counter a lot of decks. If you see any 3 MP card on this list that is a unit, SDT Dante can tear them apart. This card saw a lot of play in Breakaway, and for that reason alone, he's at least an A tier card. I think he's kind of up to personal choice whether you want to play him, but he does give the deck a good early play if you're trying to wait them out just by playing SDT Dante down. He's not the strongest card in that deck, that's definitely Lechku, but I guess we'll put him right behind Lechku. Next we have the Arch Assassin from Strider, who has immediately become one of the strongest comeback mechanics in the game, and really does not have the downside that these other cards have. It's so powerful that it is very worth being a comeback exclusive type of card. And if you're gonna play a lock deck, this card is much better than Rose. This card is undoubtedly one of the cards that is pushing Purple Breakaway to the top of the tier list. She is undoubtedly one of the strongest S tier cards in the game. Next we have Red Butterfly's Betrayal, which I think is a very cool card in the current purple lock strategy. You can play an Ada Wong from your hand or any of your 5 lock cards, and doing so is kind of unrespondable. They get a big buff if it's your agility girl. She's really strong and can run away with the game. I think this card is at least B+ tier. And now, the black cards for Defying the Light. We have Defiler Nergigante, finally a really good card for Nerg. This card is pretty scary in change form where you're playing almost all units in your hand, but in that deck it does suffer from the Unleashed downside of being a comeback card. At the very least though, this card is super tanky, constantly healing itself, so I think at the very least it's a strong A tier card. Next we have Goddess of Ruin Miria, one of the comeback mechanics in the game that really warp despair. This card really leans into its Unleashed. It feels weird to say that a 10 MP card gets you way more value than that, but if this card hits the field with Unleash and pulls Unleash Orchis or any other card like Proto Angelo, the value is crazy. The card that it explores if she's Unleashed as well is one of the strongest control cards at 1 MP that you can possibly have. I think I'm probably overrating it a bit here, but I'm going to put it above Lechku. And last for DTL, other than the supplements, we have Last Judgment, which is a card that I'm a big fan of, but I think it's definitely a card that's kind of up to personal choice if you play it or not. I think the value can be big, but you have to really set it up to actually have something on board. It's not quite brainwashed, even though it wants to be. And the final legendaries, the final supplementals, we have Leave It To Me, which seemed like a card that was going to do whatever red decks wanted to do, but I think ended up being a little overhyped. I thought this card seemed really good, but I think it's only as good as the red decks it's in, which are pretty good right now, but this card is kind of This card is kind of take it or leave it. It's not really pushing red to another level, but it is a very strong card. Next we have Tiny Hero Feline, who on release already kind of had a deck that wanted to use him, and along with the other supplemental green card that came out with him, is one of the best legendaries in the game right now. His deck is tearing up the game, and he's a powerful comeback mechanic. The only thing keeping me from putting him higher is the fact that he's a little vanilla when you really get down to it. He's not doing a whole lot that the other cards in his deck aren't doing, except for being a dual tribe unit which has synergy with Kenzuki resistance. I'm going to put him in A+, but I think he should be a little bit lower than these cards that are more interesting than him. Next we have Key to the Cage, which is very similar to the other 1 MP cycle kind of actions, but this one doesn't go MP even, and its effect is like really cool, but it's not better than these other cards. I haven't really seen it pop off to a super huge degree. It's kind of hard to really set up, but it is very strong. And the last card we are going to rank on our tier list is Destructive Force Guile 5. Who made a natural inclusion on a very powerful deck, but he's not quite as strong as the other boss monster in the deck, Franziska, and being defined to that one deck is gonna make me leave him in B+. I'm gonna put him right around where Sadler is. I think he's a really strong card, he's really cool, he'll keep Uro powerful, but Franziska is the card that people are scared of when they think of that deck. Alright, so now at the end of the tier list, I've made a couple changes. One of the biggest changes I made was moving Raymarsh up a bit. She's one of the cards that really make Change Form one of the best decks right now. I also moved Dante down to A. I think it really is personal choice whether you play him in your breakaway. And the last change I think I'm gonna make is moving Stay Close to the top of the tier list. This card is kind of as strong as the deck it's played in, but the decks that play this card are just about the best in the game right now. So I think it's a fair pick for the top card on the tier list. Behind that, we have a couple of cards that either have no counter or will counter anything that your opponent could possibly have. In A+ here, we have a couple of the strongest win conditions in the game, and cards that can deal with anything or give you more advantage than other cards will on their own. A-tier cards are some of the strongest cards in the game, in a vacuum at least. They might require a bit more investment, but if we give these cards their best case scenario, then they are some of the strongest cards that you could possibly be playing. Dan might be the biggest overrate, he doesn't do a whole lot, but he's generically very good for 3 MP. I'll leave him where he is, basically. I'll leave him right behind Virgil. Like, he deserves his high placement. B+, we're starting to get into cards that might be a little more archetypal, but these are cards with some of the highest power level in the game, if you can make them work. Cards in B tier can be potentially very powerful if you know how to make them work, but they're a little more limited in where you can play them and might require a bit of setup or know-how about the game to get the most value out of them. These are all still very strong cards, but they're not necessarily strong on their own. You definitely have to build around these cards a little more than the other cards on the list, but you can definitely get a lot done with them. D tier cards might not quite have the most impact in the world, but if you like the card, you can definitely make it work, and these are not bad cards by any mean. F tier cards really do not cut it. You do not want to invest in these cards, and if you have, you probably regret it. That is every card that you can currently play in TEPPEN Standard Ranked. This was a huge list. This took a lot longer than I thought it would. If you guys enjoyed this, let me know. Let me know how I did, especially red players. I want to know if I got it right, because I don't play red. I play against a lot of red. And if you want to see an update of this for next season, let me know. I'll probably go over point match during the update, so we still have 100 cards. But you guys will have to let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in, considering this one was already really long. Definitely let me know what you guys thought of this video. Please like the video if you liked the video. Subscribe if you subscribed. Once again, I'm Sconchulus, and I'll see you in the next one.